Welcome to episode 12 of the A-Plus Show. My name is Michael Appel.
I'm Alec Hogg.
This is a jam-packed 30-minute show with snippets of useful information on business, politics, news, investments. Alec, take us straight into the markets. I see the inflation figures are out and it's worse than expected in South Africa.
Yeah, but you can relax a little bit because inflation here is still lagging the US and the UK by quite some distance. The UK's numbers were 9.4%, US 9.1%. Those are 40-year highs. In South Africa, we at just over 7%, but we're at 13-year highs. So, just put it in comparison. We understand how to deal with high inflation. The Americans and the Brits don't. And we're seeing the realization, perhaps, that it might well have peaked in the US. The stock markets in America have done very well this week. After the inflation figures came out, initially there was concerns. The feeling now is that, yes, there will be further interest rate hikes, but that with a strong dollar, it's going to reduce the cost of the biggest mover of inflation in the US, which is energy. Energy prices are up 60% year on year in America, and that's been pushing inflation. So now we're looking at about a 6% improvement in the markets in the past week, and some good numbers coming out from tech companies, in particular Netflix, which had two very bad quarters. Now it had a good quarter. So it's up 14% this week, which of course doesn't help us in our portfolio because we lost patience with it and we sold it last month. But it is what it is. I'd rather be out of Netflix, actually. And then Tesla's numbers came out last night, which were very positive. And however, not good for Bitcoin because Tesla had a $1.5 billion position in Bitcoin, of which it's now sold 3/4. So the Bitcoin price, which had been on a bit of a tear this week, that went backwards after its number one supporter, Elon Musk, said he had sold $1 billion worth of it within the company. As far as the rand's concerned, it's pretty much where it was before. Interesting stuff going on here in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Although the JSE All-Share Index hasn't done a heck of a lot, the analysts are now starting to look forward to financial results. Now, it's important to realize in the United States, the companies there report every 3 months. In South Africa, it's every 6 months. So we don't get quite the amount of attention on financials as they do in the US. But this past week, we've seen a couple of really strong movers ahead of financial results being published. The one is ArcelorMittal, the steel company. That was up 16% yesterday, and that is building on some significant increases earlier in the week. And then Grindrod Shipping, which is benefiting, no doubt, from the high shipping prices. That share just keeps going higher and higher. So both of those, we can expect very strong results from them in the next few days. It's our reporting season starting soon.
Yeah. Okay, and 2 years' time, the general election will be taking place. We've been spending a lot of time speaking to those in the know or those who potentially are looking into their crystal balls for what 2024 could hold for South Africa. Now, there's a lot of pundits writing their obituary of the ANC. I know you've spoken to a lot of people who are doing that. I spoke to a political science prof at UCT, Prof. Anthony Butler, and we spoke about a host of things, but I just want to kick off with this soundbite here about coalition partners 2024. Let's just listen to what he had to say and then we can discuss it.
The EFF is more than simply a natural coalition partner for the ANC. It's also, I would say, essentially a faction. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be able to rejoin with the ANC to negotiate terms for such a deal, but it's certainly something that we should be aware of, that if the ANC becomes a minority party at national level and in the most important province from its point of view, Gauteng, then a coalition deal with its natural coalition partner, the EFF, strikes me as very likely. Electors won't like that because if you voted for the EFF because you want to get rid of the ANC and they then jump into bed with them, they're not going to vote for you so happily next time. But you can play this game at least once.
So let's speak about the hypothetical for a second. You mentioned a figure of the ANC at 35% in Gauteng.
Below 35 in the latest polls, yeah.
So let's say they do slightly better at 40%. And the EFF, they happen to get 10, 11%. It's Prof. Butler's belief that they are natural bedfellows. They are natural coalition partners because, in essence, Julius Malema, everybody knows, was the ANC Youth League president, famously said, "My blood is black, green, and gold. I will never leave the ANC." Well, we know how that turned out. But he believes that they are natural coalition partners. And despite all the politicking and the shouting and pay back the money and everything, that they are most likely to realign to, if the ANC is pushed into a minority position, that the EFF would be kingmakers, the most natural kingmakers, and that gives them a lot of power to carry out their policies come 2024. Alec, I see you sitting here in stunned silence.
I respect him. I respect Anthony. He wrote a very good biography on Cyril Ramaphosa, but I don't know if he has access to the people I have access to. That's all I want to say.
Jeepers.
Within the ANC, that is not a popular view by any means. In fact, the ANC sees the EFF as the enemy first, and the DA as very much a second enemy. But, I respect whatever. Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen when you are faced with the threat of losing power? Perhaps then you do make deals with the devil, which right now, as far as the ANC are concerned, certainly the people in the good ANC, if you want to call it that, is the last thing they would ever do. But you don't know.
There are some who believe there is no good and bad ANC. There is only the ANC, Alec. Okay, Kokkie Kooyman.
There are some very bad people in the ANC, Michael. Some very bad people. Maybe you have the bad and the less bad. That's potentially what we're saying. But what Anthony is saying is exactly what Helen Ziller said at the BizNews conference, that this is a fight not between the ANC and the DA. It's a fight between the EFF and the DA. And she actually gave an excellent presentation, which is on BizNews TV that you can go and have a look at. And well worth looking at it again, because in her view, the ANC is disintegrating. In many people's view, that is the case. And are they going to, or what comes out of it, going to be moving to the EFF side or the more open DA side? These are really interesting questions, and they're going to keep us occupied for quite some time. As far as Kokkie Kooyman is concerned, now I put to him the optimistic scenario of come 2024, a coalition takes over. The socialists are no longer in power in South Africa. What will happen? And there's some very interesting thoughts that came from him. Let's have a listen.
The low-hanging fruit in South Africa, if the government was to engage with the private sector, is just so massive. Just think of the capital needed to recapitalize and put Transnet, to put SABC, to put SAA, to put Eskom back on track, power generation, our harbours. So this country can quite easily grow at 5, 6, 7% for a few years if we were to have a Nelson Mandela who engages with the private sector and gets him to commit, and foreigners will come streaming in. So that is your golden scenario.
It's an interesting interview as well with Kokkie. He's been in the game for nearly 40 years. He's an internationally recognized asset manager. He travels a lot, is one of the top banking analysts in the world, not just in South Africa. He's won quite a few awards globally for it. And his view, as you heard there, was that with a more business-friendly South Africa, we'd be creating jobs, we'd be creating economic growth, and we'd be creating an environment conducive for global investment to come into the country rather than what has been happening for most of the last 28 years. Well, to be fair, maybe the last half of that, 14 years, where capital's been leaving. So it's an interesting point. He says if you're going to believe that scenario, then you should be buying banking shares because they're the biggest beneficiaries of any economic upswing or broad economic upswing. So it's an interesting side. You get the academic, Anthony Butler, saying no, it's not going to happen. The ANC are going to side with the EFF, and having read laboriously to get all the fluffs out of it, the Ramaphosa biography that he wrote, there are few people who know Ramaphosa better than Anthony Butler. So you have to respect his view. But on the other hand, if we were to have that scenario in 2024 where there were a coalition, whatever the political reasons for it, the economic reasons will be spectacular for this country. So it's almost like if you're giving up hope and you're saying, oh, I had enough of these criminals, I'm going elsewhere in the world. The message from a Kokkie Kooyman is just give it another 18 months. Just wait until that 2024 election, because if there is a change in government, this place is going to really boom.
Just on Prof. Butler's biography he wrote on Ramaphosa, I know that he did, so my last question to him was, what have you made of Ramaphosa's presidency? And here's an interesting answer. I won't give it all away. Go look at it on the BizNews YouTube channel. To my next interview, which was fascinatingly terrifying, I think, is the correct phrase, with Yaki Silliers. Dr. Silliers is the Institute for Security Studies chairperson. And a lot of focus has been on the state of South Africa's security for many years, but the spate of mass shootings has got the media refocusing itself on the police minister. And I spoke to Dr. Silliers and I said, let me just recap the pedigree of the man who's currently leading the police portfolio. He's the National Police Commissioner when Jacob Zuma is president. To Jacob Zuma's credit, there was a commission of inquiry to look into a 1.7 billion rand property deal involving an ANC crony called Roo Shabangu, who is mates with Becky Cele, who is the National Police Commissioner. Cele signs on and signs a property deal with his old mate Roo Shabangu. Based on the findings that Cele didn't disclose his direct conflict of interest with Roo Shabangu, he is found to be a dishonest person, and Jacob Zuma, of all people, fires him. Now, if Jacob Zuma fires you, you've got to have done something properly wrong. So what happens? Now, this is how the comrade's washing machine works. He gets deployed to Parliament as a, let's call him, well, not a backbencher entirely, but he's the Deputy Minister of Agriculture. He's not a farmer by any stretch of the imagination, but hey, that doesn't matter. He lays low there up until Ramaphosa is deployed as president, and then he takes the man who was sacked as police commissioner and makes him police minister. You cannot make this up. That is the man that is running the police portfolio. So I asked Dr. Silliers, and please go check it. It's a 30-minute interview that's up on the YouTube channel. Please go check that out. But I asked him about the recent incidents of mass shootings. Is this something new in South Africa, or has it been there all along?
They're not that new. If we go back into our crime history, which is it's happened quite a lot. We have poor border control. We have lots of unlicensed firearms. We have criminal syndicates that are well established and entrenched in South Africa, and one can carry on. These are organized crime events. The general speculation is that it's part of some type of a protection racket. We don't know the reality, but you don't deal with that problem by visible policing or bringing in tactical or other units. You deal with that by focusing laser-like on organized crime.
So he speaks about gesture policing, reactive policing. In the townships, the TRT is called the Amabarete. They are terrified because these guys come in and they are heavy-handed. Heavy-handed with all the wrong people, unfortunately. So they are feared amongst communities. We shouldn't fear our police. It's a police service, not a police force. But this gesture policing, and that is the first thing that happened in Soweto after 16 people were mowed down, is we are going to deploy the TRT to Soweto. Or what, are you going to leave them there in perpetuity? Or are they going to do everyday policing? They're a reactionary force. They're not there for sustainable community relation building. they should be going after organized criminals. So Dr. Silje is saying we need to stop with this gesture policing. Becky Cele on TV, they raid shebeens and they pour the booze out in the drain. It looks really cool, makes for a nice shot. What does it actually do to fight crime in the country?
It's a really, really good interview, that one, Mike. I would recommend anybody who's interested in understanding what's going on in South Africa and the police side, watch it.
Piet Viljoen.
Yeah, well, he's one of our favorites here. He's going to be at the BizNews conference again. It'll be the fourth time he's there, and it is only the fourth conference. And Piet has been the top-rated fund manager in South Africa over the past 5 years, 3 years, whatever period you want to look at. He has, however, come under a bit of pressure over the past few months because he was heavily invested in resources shares, and those resources shares have fallen significantly. His view is that you need to understand whether a decline in the share price is a permanent or temporary loss of value. It's permanent when you sell it, obviously, but should you be selling it? And we had a good conversation around that, typical Piet explaining to us how we should understand investing better. But in this little clip, I asked him about resources shares, which he says are cheap now, whether we should be buying them. And not surprisingly, Piet's the kind of guy who says, if you've got a hamburger that goes for half price, you should buy two. Same with shares.
Resource shares in 2014, 2015 had very stretched balance sheets. So when the commodity price came down, they made losses, big losses, and had to issue equity, dilute their shareholders. That represented a permanent loss of capital at that time. Today, if you look at the top 10 shares and say the Counterpoint Value Fund, there's one common denominator. All those companies have very solid balance sheets and are generating very strong cash flows.
In other words, there's no permanent lack of or loss of value in the lower share prices. They are much better positioned now than they were in the last downturn in the commodity cycle, and they're cheap. That's Piet's thesis.
I see Berkshire Hathaway got involved in oil recently.
Yeah, they've been buying Occidental Petroleum,
Yes.
but Warren Buffett's been at it for a while. Piet's also, in this interview, talks a lot about ESG and how the pendulum swung, society's pendulum swung far too much to the one side. And of course, when society gets a fashion in its heads, then the financial services industry is only too happy to feed it through all of these ESG funds, which have been poor performers and very expensive. There's quite a lot of controversy around that from those who look from the outside and say it's not ethical to do this. But those who are in the industry have made a lot of money out of the public, and the public, once again, have been taken for a bit of a ride there. He talks about that in some detail. It's another good, we've actually had some really good interviews this week, Mark. I don't know why. It's maybe we've been getting up early in the morning or something.
Yeah. Speaking of taking the public for a ride, Alec, this is the best way. I was thinking of how best to describe this. A second Eskom. Now, I thought, hold on, you've got, let's say you've got you've got pancreatic problems. And I come to you and I say, you know what you need is you need another pancreas. And that is exactly what Mantashe has come to the South African public with. And that is this whole notion of Eskom 2.0, a second state-run power utility to create competition in the electricity space in South Africa. Now, if you're watching this thinking, you've got to be joking. Very, very serious about this. This was an idea mooted before the South African Communist Party. El Presidente, Ramaphosa, was there. And what did he think of it, Alec, quote unquote? Well, that's a great idea. And so I spoke to the DA's Shadow Minister of Public Enterprises, Caleb Kachalia, and we were discussing a bunch of things like the Brinturian estate in Pretoria by virtue of being close to the union buildings, is because it's tough to decouple areas that are around national key points from the grid. They scored on that one, and they're exempt from load shedding.
So these are the MPs or cabinet ministers?
Yeah, these are cabinet ministers who are exempt from load shedding, when interestingly hospitals are not. Hospitals need to buy generators and fund that themselves. So I asked Caleb Kuchalia whether or not he spat out his coffee when he heard about Eskom 2.0.
I did spit my coffee out, as you put it, and frankly, it's preposterous. It harks back to a Soviet-era procedure called socialist emulation, which Lenin mooted and Stalin rolled out. Now, given it's no coincidence, in my view, that President Ramaphosa was speaking to the Congress of the Communist Party when he made these statements, which would resonate with the folly that they were fed over many years and that they still cling to for some inexplicable reason. He did, however, backtrack slightly from it when he visited Tutuka Power Station and said that we must fix Eskom. That's our first priority.
A little bit of knowledge is an incredibly dangerous thing. And when you have these politicians who, I guess, don't have the time to really go and study the history, they cling on to the little bits of knowledge that the Communist Party might have told them, without actually understanding it. And it's a very similar situation here with what's going on with the 500 black industrialists. The Americans did the same thing in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, where they supported specially selected individuals who then were subsidized by the state, with taxpayers' money, to build enterprises. And you might have heard of a guy called Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the richest people ever in the world. What Cornelius Vanderbilt did was he targeted these guys and competed with them. And if they were prepared to compete with him, these people, funded by the US taxpayer, then he beat them by just being more efficient. Because when you subsidize something, it's inefficient. When they were too scared to compete with him because they knew that he would take them out, they paid him off with taxpayer money, the competition. What we are doing in South Africa is we are repeating US 1830, 40, 50, where it's 150 years ago, they tried the same thing we're trying now. Find people that you like, loyal to the party, 500 black industrialists who clearly are not going to be voting for Herman Mashaba or somebody else. Fund them, but better than that, you get your president coming out and saying to corporate South Africa, help these guys, help these guys. The insanity never ceases to end. But it's not really insanity. It's ignorance. It's an inability to actually pick up the history books, read a little bit, and understand, as Mark Twain has always said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
And the potential cost of another state-owned entity, forget the fact that it'll take a decade.
They're joking, and they're joking, Michael.
2 trillion
Nobody
rand.
will fund it.
2 trillion rand. There's nobody who's going to fund it. We wouldn't fund the nuclear deal because it was completely unaffordable. And now you have them coming out saying, yeah, a second state-owned entity worth 2 trillion rand. It has to be a joke. It has to be a joke.
Gwedi Mantashe has got some good ideas. He really has. He hasn't been sucked into the whole renewable energy is the only way to go. So let's be like Germany and then be beholden to Putin because we've closed all our coal plants. He said, no, coal's still got a role to play. Good for you, Gwedi. But this, I don't know what he was smoking or drinking at the time that he came up with this crazy idea. Although it does stem back to a lady called Mariana Mazzucato, who is a professor at a UK university who's become the high priestess of economic thinking in South Africa. And her thesis is that the government must be the one doing the investing, not the private sector. Insanity, it rules, not just in South Africa, but in many other parts of the world. And if you want to make an argument, you can kind of get the facts that will support yours as well. Wow. Perhaps Ms. Mazzucato should be had a look at, and her theories, which are now just being sucked in. She's the only foreigner on the Economic Advisory Council. So maybe get some local guys who've actually been there, done that, and read a few books.
Yeah. The way I see it, you've got appendicitis in Eskom. What do you need? Another appendix? Yeah, good thing.
Another infected appendix.
Indeed.
Because it is going to be.
It's going to be. It's going to be. The track record is there for all to see. Okay. Tongaat Hulett.
Well, we can close off with another controversial story, something in the private sector where, when Piet spoke a bit earlier in the week, he said permanent loss of value often comes from fraud. Sign-off, people who invest in sign-off have lost their money. Tongaat, they've lost their money as well. And David Woollam is a chartered accountant. He used to be the financial director of Appel, African Bank, while it was still a reputable organization. He left long before the implosion. And his father-in-law used to work for Tongaat in a very senior position. So he knows Tongaat well. He's been talking to the directors of Tongaat since before the fraud hit, and he's continuing to talk to them. And now he's lost patience. Let's just hear what he's saying.
As I say, I'm appalled. I've been trying to, I guess, talk nicely about this for a long time, but this is appalling. I think this board should stand down, and quite frankly, we are appealing to the JSE today to not suspend the share. We don't think it should be suspended. There's a really interesting question here: is why should a company be allowed to suspend its shares because it's convenient? The share trading is the right of the shareholders.
Just to put that into context, Tongaat went to the JSE and said, suspend trading in our shares because we can't give you financial results. The reason we can't give you financial results is we are not a going concern. We need to raise money before we aren't bankrupt. We're bankrupt, basically. And the auditors won't sign off the accounts unless we've got money that's coming into the business from somewhere. We're negotiating with the banks to do that. And what David Woollam says is, surely the fact that they're not a going concern, the fact that they aren't being signed off by the auditors is a much, much bigger question, because they've been dealing with this now for 3 years.
A going concern? Just explain that.
If you're a company, your very, very first priority is that you have to have your books audited, which says that you can continue in business. Otherwise, you are defrauding anybody who's lending you money, anybody who you're giving products to, anybody you're buying from. So your number one priority as a business, if you're not a going concern, in fact, you can be held criminally liable if you conduct business knowing that you aren't a going concern. Tongaat is not a going concern. They have more liabilities than assets. Unless somebody gives them money, they're bankrupt. And that's the situation we're at. What Woollam is saying, the board has been messing this thing up for 3 years now. They should step down, and he also says the management should go. So why? He's a shareholder, and he's representing a big shareholder group. He said, I've been playing nice for a long time. I'm not playing nice anymore. Postscript to all of this was that the JSE did not suspend the shares until Monday or Tuesday, where they came with another approach, which was to say they hadn't released their financial results. So the JSE forced them to suspend it. So first they wanted to voluntarily suspend the share. Now it's an actual suspension. I can't wait for Gavin Hudson, the CEO, to get back from Zimbabwe. He's promised to give us an interview, and let's find out what's going on at Tongaat.
It's been a heavy week of news, Alec.
We've had a really good, and we've seen it. We've seen the community has been consuming an enormous amount of our content. Our numbers are through the roof. I mean, I thought after last week with Ian Cameron, it would be a hard act to follow, and yet, well done, Mark.
Yeah,
it's rolling.
You see, Ian Cameron's all over. I don't know how active you're on Twitter, but he is all over in the Western Cape, meeting with DA leaders. They did a very cool thing where they painted over gang signs with each person putting their handprint on the wall, kind of take back the community from the gangsters, one sort of fingerprint or handprint at a time. So and I won't call it a stunt, his very authentic moment before that Gugulethu community meeting has really elevated his presence on social media, and a lot of the work that he's doing, which is very good work that is often behind the scenes, that is unappreciated, is now finally getting the exposure that it deserves. So good for him.
This is a country which proves the point that one person can make a difference.
Yeah.
And good for Ian Cameron. Yeah. And long may the Ian Camerons continue to emerge from our society to address this insanity that we've lived with for the last 28 years. And hopefully won't have to live with again after 2024. But who knows? It's complex and things change.
Thank you for staying in our company for the last 30 minutes. We'll see you next week.
Cheerio.